Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews, where an evangelical encounters the restoration. I'm your host, Stephen Pynakker, and I am very excited about this panel discussion that we were able to put together with the help of Joe Geisner, who is the editor of the book Writing Mormon History. This is actually volume 1. Volume 2 will actually be coming out very, very soon, so we're actually going to kind of do a little preview of it later in the episode as well. But this is really a very important book dealing with writing Latter-day Saint history and the processes that the authors went through and some of the challenges that they faced as they're engaging and grappling with these historical topics. Just real quick, I just want to remind everybody about a couple things. So I'm going to share the screen here. It's going to hop on here right now. Okay, so folks, I just want to remind you that, Mormon Book Reviews is basically the leading channel when it comes to Mormon culture, history, breaking news. Just last week, we broke the two biggest stories in Mormonism, and it's become a real important place. We were the one that broke the story about the new community of Christ prophet, as well as the church is going to be moving into an LGBTQ affirming congregation and sharing space with them, which I think were two very important stories that we covered. I also want to point out to everybody, hold on one second here. I want to point out to everybody, well, that's actually not important. I was actually going to talk about Nehemiah Gordon, who's one of the top Hebrew scholars in the world. And him and I are very, very good friends. And he is engaging the Book of Mormon. Matter of fact, just yesterday, he taped a 3-hour interview with Royal Skousen, which I was able to help arrange. And starting in March, Nehemiah and I are actually going to be doing a reading through the Book of Mormon, and we're going to have various Mormon scholars engaging. I've talked to many, many people about what we're going to do. And what we're going to do is actually we're going to start off with the Book of Mosiah, because of course, what is called the Mosiah priority. So we're actually going to read the Book of Mormon in the order that it was received and dictated, and use this as an opportunity to share with a lay audience modern Book of Mormon scholarship. So that's just one of the exciting things that we're working on. So stay tuned for that. So Joe, I want you to turn on your microphone real quick. And Joe, I'm going to have you talk briefly for a second here. Joe is the editor of this book. And what I'd like for you to do, Joe, is, and I know this is kind of last minute, I'd actually like for you to maybe introduce each and every one of our panelists and just briefly describe them for the audience, and then we'll start interviewing them.
Now I just have to remember who's all on, right? Okay. So we'll start out with Bill McKinnon. Bill, well, I'm not going to do the whole biography, but my introduction to Bill, there was many, many years ago, there was a book group. We had a book group that are my good friends, Hugh McKell and Keith Irwin, started, called LDS Bookshelf. And Bill came on that after Will Bagley had convinced him to join the Kingdom in the West series. And so that was my first introduction to Bill. And I, as with every single person in this group, I became enamored with them immediately. And Bill was no exception to that. Bill, as with everybody on here, is, again, one of those bright people that I feel quite lucky that I met. Polly Aird. Polly and I've not met in person. Well, actually, I guess Bill and I have not met in person a whole lot either, mainly MHA and those kind of events. But Polly, same thing. And when she was also brought on to do the Kingdom in the West, the excitement for that, and so much. Let's see, Brian Hales. Brian is, as many people know, the author of 3 volumes of Joseph Smith's Polygamy. And Brian and I have had wonderful debates about Joseph Smith's Polygamy. And I don't want to reveal too much about Brian, but when he accepted to do a chapter for Writing Mormon History, that was exciting, because up until that point, I really had no one to, I think the best word is advocate for the LDS community's beliefs in the divinity of Joseph Smith and his polygamy. And so that was exciting. And it's also fun because Writing Mormon History has 3 chapters specifically from authors who wrote about polygamy. Brian being one of those, George Smith on his book Nauvoo Polygamy, and Todd Compton on his book In Sacred Loneliness. So Susan Staker, Susan and I probably have spent the most time together just for various reasons, but she and her husband have a home in Sacramento. And so when Susan was alive, we would meet up with Dawn and Susan and have lunch, usually in Fairfield. Just Susan and I have just been in the same places a lot. So I feel very honored. And Susan is in a unique position. She's one of the women that was there at the beginning of the new Mormon history. And people don't realize how significant that is. And that was one of the things I wanted to be brought out in Writing Mormon History, is these women who went through so much. And it's actually quite sad that I've only had Susan and Linda Newell and Jill Durr, which Jill Durr will be in volume 2, write about that period, because what the odds against them were incredible. And I don't want to leave out Daniel Stone. I remember meeting Daniel at that first Sunstone, and I sat there and my mouth was on the floor as I listened to Daniel. And I thought, this, he reminded me of Mike Quinn, and his ability not only to present the information, but present it in a way that was both interesting and informative. That's a gift. That's a gift that Mike Quinn had. And I would suggest that Daniel has that same gift.
Well, that's
Did I-
very high praise, and it's an honor to have such an esteemed panel. And yeah, people are always saying, where's Daniel Stone? Why don't we have him see him at these other conferences? People would love to get you more engaged in this community, including Dr. Christopher Thomas, who wrote A Pentecostal Reads the Book of Mormon. Would love to see more of your work. And I just wanted to point out, and I showed this to Daniel, this weekend I showed up for the Quorum of the 12 met at the Forest Hills congregation in Florida, and Josh Gailey, who's an evangelist in the church, gave me their version of the Book of Mormon to me. And this past Saturday, I actually had 11 of the 12 apostles of the Church of Jesus Christ sign their names and give me their favorite Book of Mormon verse. It was very exciting. And it was Joel Gailey, the president of the church, who actually was the person who went around and collected those signatures and verses for me. So I want to thank you. Daniel, you're the only person here who's actually been on the program before. And so it's great to see you all again. And well, Joe, I want to thank you so much for me springing that on you to do the introductions, but I also just wanted you to turn your microphone on one more time. And I wanted you just to talk about, I want to kind of do like an overview a little bit. What made you decide, what was the reasons why you wrote the intro on this, and you also wrote a chapter in this book as well, but basically you're the editor. What was the impetus for putting this together?
Gary Bajera had, who was the chief editor for Signature Books, wanted to do an anthology series, and Signature had done one, and Gary's Line Upon Line was actually the first volume in that anthology series. So he wanted to start that back up again. And the way that was set up was you would usually only have one new chapter that had been written specifically for the book. All the other chapters were from Sunstone Dialogue, BYU Studies, and John Whitmer historical journal, and it could even be from other journals. But that was sort of what he wanted to do. And there have been a few of those, by the way. There was a temple book that I believe Christian Larson edited, and that's one of those. So there have been some of those, but well, I had read multiple stories about books, and being a book collector, I mean, you see some books behind me, but this is really just a small group of what my library. I became addicted. Actually became addicted on my mission, and but Gary had asked me to do that, so I said, "How would you feel if I asked authors, and also there's a couple of authors who've written their story, and we could add those in. Bob Flanders being one of those. He wrote and Bob Flanders, just so people know who he is, because your crowd may not realize who Bob Flanders is, but Bob, when I met Bob the first time, I said to him, "You're the Fawn Brody of the RLDS." Which is now the Community of Christ. And he laughed and he said, "Nobody's ever said that to me," but he said, "I feel that's quite an honor." And Bob was a true intellectual. When he would talk to you, you would feel like you're probably 5 or 6 pages behind in what he's talking about, and you need to catch up real quick. One of the most intelligent people I've ever met. And so he wrote a book called Kingdom on the Mississippi, which was really the first true scholarly work on Nauvoo. And he shortly after that left the RLDS church, the RLDS faith. He was highly criticized. He was probably as criticized as much for that book as Fawn Brody was for No Man Knows My History. And this was late 60s when he did that. And I believe he joined the Methodist religion after that, I believe. And but anyway, so Bob wrote this fantastic history of his doing Kingdom on the Mississippi. So I said to Gary, I said, "How about if we do that?" And he said, "No, I want you now to go. I don't want anything that's been published. I want you to find authors who are willing to write their story, and this is the first time." So that's what we did.
Wow, fascinating. So we're going to get started on our first author. And then it's really an honor to have Mr. Bill McKinnon on the program today. He wrote a chapter. His research was regarding the Utah War. What I find so interesting, Bill, is that you actually come from a Presbyterian background, and so you're an outsider, much like I am, engaging restorationist history. And I really, reading your chapter really resonated with me, because even though a lot of people go and say, "Well, why is it here you are as an evangelical outsider? What makes you so interested in Mormon history?" I said, have you actually read it? Have you actually engaged the story? It's one of the greatest stories ever told on American soil, and it's a remarkable story. And everybody finds their niche that they find so interesting. And for whatever reason, the Utah War enthralled you. Maybe just talk, Bill, about what got you so interested in that subject and a lifelong interest in this time period.
Okay, would be happy to. I hope everybody can hear.
Loud and clear.
I've unmuted for the occasion, so here goes. Let me just start, Stephen, by commenting on what an unusual thing it is that Signature Books and Joe undertook in bringing out Writing Mormon History, Volume 1, and I'm happy to see there's a second one in the works, and I predict there might be more than that. It is an anthology about Mormon history, but more than that, it's an anthology about Mormon historians, and that's pretty unusual. just think of the number of books you've read in which the publisher has no interest in saying anything more about the author than maybe one sentence or two. Okay, I'm always reminded of what J.D. Salinger's publisher put on the dust jacket for one of his novels. It wasn't Catcher in the Rye, but maybe the next one. The book was brought out to a lot of anticipation and acclaim, and the most that the publisher could muster about Salinger was to say, Mr. Salinger lives in Vermont with his dog. That was it. and most of the author information that I've seen since then in other books isn't much more than that type of a background. So what Signature and Joe have done is very unusual. And so I began my contribution to Writing Mormon History, titled Enlisted for the Duration, Discovering the Utah War, Discovering Mormon History and the Utah War. Relates a little story in which I wrote an article years ago, I think it was for Dialogue, about my key discoveries about the Utah War at about the 50-year mark in my researches. And I started by describing how I got interested in it. And that article was summarized on one of the blogs in the Bloggernacle, and a reader of the blog, a fellow named Matt W., I never really learned his full name, reacted to the review of my article in Dialogue by telling the world that I ought to put as he phrased it, put a sock in it, McKinnon. I mean, he said, we're not interested in who you are or why you wrote this stuff. Just get out and tell us about what you've discovered during these 50 years. So when Joe approached me about doing a chapter in Writing Mormon History, my first reaction was to rethink the put a sock in it admonition, and told Joe I wasn't sure it was such a great idea, but he convinced me. So here I am, and here it is. I'll just repeat what Steve and Joe have said. I'm not a Latter-day Saint, never have been, probably never will be, although there have been attempts to get me to think about that. I'm a Presbyterian from upstate New York, east of Palmyra by 100 or so miles near Albany. But my interest in Mormonism started not with Joseph Smith and Palmyra. It started with Brigham Young, because although I grew up in upstate New York, I was totally unaware of Mormonism until I picked up in high school a book that was a biography of Brigham Young, one of the early ones. And that's what captured my interest. It wasn't the religion as a religion or Joseph Smith, the founding prophet. It was Brigham Young and what he had done. That was really startling for me. So I read the book in high school and then came back to the subject in college when I was doing a history honors major. And I cut a deal with the history department at Yale that they'd let me out of my last 2 years of classes if I produced something like a PhD dissertation. And the topic that I picked to write on was FDR's attempt to pack the Supreme Court in 1936. And after doing 2 weeks of research on that subject, I concluded I'd made a mistake. I mean, it was, for me, dull, dull, dull. So I went to my frontier history course teacher, Howard Lamar, later to become the dean of Yale College, the Sterling Professor of History, and eventually the president of Yale, and asked his advice on a topic that was a little more interesting than the Supreme Court packing caper. And he suggested I go over to the Yale Collection of Western Americana, introduce myself to the curator, Archie Hanna, and asked to see an enormous trove of material that Yale had acquired in the 1940s from a benefactor named William Robertson Coe, who had no connection to Yale at all when he donated all this stuff. I mean, freight car loads full of primary source material arrived in New Haven from his estate on Long Island during the 1940s. I mean, apparently Mrs. Coe had lost patience with him. His collecting mania was even worse than Joe's. And she told him he had to get the stuff out of the house And Mr. Coe originally approached Harvard, where his sons were students, but Harvard declined the honor of receiving his collection, thinking that the American West was not a suitable topic for the Harvard manuscript collection to be acquiring. So at this point, the Yale University librarian, Jim Babb, who was from Idaho, heard about Harvard's rejection, swooped in and got Mr. Coe to deliver this enormous amount of material. So I went over to look at it at Howard Lamar's suggestion, and the curator explained what Coe had donated and showed me a few items. What was then called the Utah expedition popped up into my consciousness. He suggested that maybe I should spend my last 2 years as an undergraduate trying to wrestle that subject to the ground, and it was so intriguing to me that I thought I'd do it. Again, it wasn't so much the religion or Joseph Smith, it was the movement west, what happened in the West, and the Brigham Young part of the story that really got my attention, especially with the Utah War. So that's how I got into this. Susan has called herself in more than one venue an accidental historian, and I think that's a very apt label, not only for her, but for maybe everybody on this panel, but certainly me. I mean, I didn't set out in a straight line to do what I've done up until today over the last 65 plus years. So I spent my 2 years doing my senior essay on the Utah expedition. It went just fine, enabled me to graduate, and off I went. And by the time I graduated, I had kind of caught the bug of interest in this subject. And when I went on to business school at Harvard, I kept on researching there. And then when I went to work in business in Manhattan, I would spend Saturdays at the New York Public Library, which is really a research library more than a lending library, at least at its main branch on Fifth Avenue. And by sheer coincidence, the New York Public Library has an enormous collection of diaries and letters about the Utah War, which I didn't realize till I stumbled into it in the early 60s. And away I've gone, and my chapter in Joe's anthology describes how one thing led to another. That, by the way, is one of my principal findings in all this, is the power of serendipity. It's not just dumb luck as I think about it. It's the mind willing to spot opportunities and interesting leads and to pursue them. It's not a matter of just sitting around staring out the window and waiting for something interesting to happen and some research leads to materialize. You had to prepare yourself for it. And that's really been the story of how I've gone about doing research. Consistent with my early interests, I haven't been researching the religion from a theological standpoint. All of you know much more about that than I do. But I have a working knowledge of that subject. But it's who the Mormon people were and what they accomplished and how they went about doing it and under what circumstances. That's what really intrigued me. And what I discovered early on back in the 50s at Yale was there was very little published on the subject. There were a couple of church histories. B.H. Roberts' multi-volume history had some very good chapters on this subject. But most of the primary source material, say on the federal side, was restricted to a couple of government documents that published military orders and other documents, a couple of collections of letters that individual soldiers involved in the campaign had brought out. The first one probably being Jesse A. Go's letters from 1928 that the New Hampshire Historical Society published, and then Albert Tracy's diary, which the Utah State Historical Society published in 1945. That was about it when I started down this road. And what I wanted to do in the course of pursuing what became the 2-volume documentary history of the Utah War was to get out the story of what it was that really happened from the point of view of both sides and the participants on both sides. What happened? How did that differ from what information was already available? And the colorful nature of the stories and the experiences that these people had was what really kept me going. I mean, I hear a lot of people, I heard it as recently as 2 nights ago, people say they got turned off on the subject of history because of a preoccupation with dates and other detail of that kind that they weren't interested in it. That's a shame. The interesting part, the heart of it, I think, are the stories. And in this particular area, with the Latter-day Saints, with the Far West and the American military involved, it's the colorfulness of it that surprised me. And in the course of doing my research, which took a long time, it was one surprise after another. And certainly, as I said before, this was not pursuing history in a straight line. I mean, the serendipitous nature of what turned up was just fantastic. And so that's one of my key findings, is the importance of serendipity and how to prepare to use it. That's not a subject that's taught in graduate school history courses. It's not recognized as a legitimate tool because it's sort of vague and elusive and for many people unsubstantive. But it works. I like it a little bit to my old Air Force squadron, which used to control air traffic in and out of the Berlin air corridors. If the radar equipment wasn't the right equipment, if it wasn't properly calibrated, if it wasn't manned by an operator who knew what she or he were doing, and if it wasn't turned on and pointed in the right direction, nothing happened. But if all that worked, you could do amazing things with radar equipment in terms of preventing air accidents and doing other things with aircraft. And that's what I liken historical research to in a sense. It's the use of an individual's radar properly calibrated and experienced. A lot of interesting conclusions and surprises, which I listed in summary fashion towards the end of the second volume of At Sword's Point. At Sword's Point, by the way, started off as a single volume when Bob Clark and the Arthur H. Clarke Company convinced me to come on board with Will Bagley and the Kingdom of the West series. I think it's now, Polly, what is it, 15 volumes, is it, or more? Originally, I thought we could do this in one volume, but after a couple of years of research, I realized that there was so much material that was wholly unexploited, not something anybody was aware of, that it was going to take 2. And at one point, I even thought about 3, at which point Bob Clark kind of gagged and pleaded with me to saw it off at 2. So I guess in total, it's maybe 1,300 pages of documents stitched together with extensive narrative, extensive footnotes, and a long introduction and a long conclusion and epilogue section, which I originally hadn't planned to use, but Bagley convinced me to add to the second volume before we wrapped it up.
Well, Bill, I just wanted to interject really quick too. What you had referred to in the book is that was a ruthless culling process, that you had to cut so much out and still had 1,300 pages. So that just the sheer amount of volume of materials that you're able to accumulate, and the fact that you refer to it as a ruthless culling process, there's a lot you had to leave out in order to even fit it in 2 volumes. Maybe just talk about maybe the process of what, I mean, just what made you decide to put certain things in and take certain things out, and just also the fact that this is a lifetime commitment that you've made to study this, which is amazing to me.
Well, in terms of the culling, I frankly, I forget whether it was the first volume or the second, but when we got near the point where the manuscript had to be submitted for its final review, Bob Clark convinced me to use the term that you quoted, Steve, ruthless. And I cut the last draft of that volume by 47%. I mean, I was almost in tears. And basically, I did it by, I shortened some stuff. But mainly, the standard was, has this been published somewhere else? Is it available somewhere else? And if the answer was yes, that I didn't include that document. I might have referred to it by footnote so that readers would pick up a clue there, but didn't want to publish anything that was not brand new. And then the issue of how important and relevant is it? I mean, do I need 2 documents on the same subject or 3? So that was part of it. Was, as Jackie Gleason used to say, I tried to stifle myself in terms of shortening what I was writing at great length, and the rest of it was being very draconian about using stuff that had been published elsewhere, but leaving footprints and markers.
One thing I wanted to also,
in terms of it being a lifetime commitment, that's what it's turned out to be, but it didn't start off to be that. And I'm still writing a lot of stuff that's not about the Utah War or Mormonism. The commitment has been to write about the West and to write about things that aren't known elsewhere, that I think are interesting and important. That's really what my commitment is to. But so much was on the cutting room floor by the time Clark and Bagley got through with me that I've been writing articles and short books about a lot of that material. For example, one came out in 2022 called Fact, Fiction, and Polygamy, which I did with Ken Alford, a faculty member at BYU, about the work of Albert G. Brown, who was the New York Tribune's war correspondent in Utah during the Utah War. There was a little bit about Brown in At Sword's Point, Volume 2, but the story of who Brown was and what he did with it went way beyond that. And so Fact, Fiction, and Polygamy, which, as I said, came out in 2022, was really constructed from material that I just couldn't use in this other study because of length, but I thought was interesting enough to include. I mean, Albert G. Brown was a Boston Brahmin who had 2 degrees from Harvard, a PhD from the University of Heidelberg, and a murder indictment under his belt when he arrived in Utah and became a buddy of Jim Bridger, who was an illiterate. He and Bridger would pal around Camp Scott, which is near what's now Fort Bridger, and Jim couldn't read or write. And he would refer to A.G. Brown, who was at that point 23 years old, I think, as doctor. He was one of the few people with the Utah War who understood that Brown had a PhD. And he found out probably only accidentally. But Bridger was both amused and very respectful of Brown's background, which was kind of viewed as an irrelevancy to most of the people involved in the campaign. Although John Bernheisel, the congressional delegate for Utah in Congress, reported to Brigham Young in November of 1857 that the Tribune had hired Brown and was paying him $200 a month, which is what Brigham Young's salary as governor of Utah Territory was. Bernheisel wanted Young to be aware of that little factoid, which I could hear the teeth gnashing in Salt Lake City as soon as Brigham Young read that little factoid. The book is full of stuff that I found interesting, and the things I couldn't use are also interesting, and some of them I'm finding ways to get into the public awareness in a different way.
Fascinating. Well,
So that's kind of a summary. I mean, one of my prime factors was not only the power of serendipity, it was that this war, the biggest military conflict in the country's history between the Mexican War and the Civil War, was not just an affair between Washington, D.C. and Salt Lake City. It encompassed the entire American West, and it captured the attention and the planning of a very large number of European and Latin American countries. It spilled into those arenas. For example, the Russians began negotiations to sell Russian America or Alaska in December of 1857 because they were afraid that Brigham Young was going to flee Utah and seize Russian America without paying them anything, sort of the way the United States and the Texans took Texas from Mexico. The British had the same worry, but they thought Brigham Young was going to head for Vancouver's Island, not Russian America. So they took all that away from the Hudson's Bay Company, which they thought was hopeless in administering it, and created the Crown Colony of British Columbia in June of 1858, and sent in the Royal Navy as defense measures against any Mormon invasion into what became British Columbia. And at the same time sent a frigate to Honolulu Harbor to ward off any Mormon attempt to land in Hawaii, where they had had missionaries since 1850. Those are the kinds of discoveries and adventures. And it spilled into Mexico. It spilled into even thinking about how Spain was administering Cuba, which President Buchanan was very interested in buying or taking. The Netherlands was concerned that Brigham Young was going to head not for the Pacific Northwest, but for the Dutch West Indies, or Dutch East Indies, I'm sorry, Sumatra or Java. And so they did certain things in that area to ward off an invasion by Latter-day Saints. And the list of countries go beyond Mexico, Great Britain, the Netherlands, and Spain. So that's a summary of what this study is about and how I got into it. And that's what's my chapter, I guess it's 8 of Joe's first volume of Writing Mormon History.
Well, one of the things you originally weren't going to write a conclusion, but actually you ended up doing that. And so many people said that just the conclusion of your series is worth the price of admission for the work that you did. And I think that's really, really cool, all this work that you've done. And I just wanted to ask you, Bill, as an outsider, and I'm going to open this up. Joe's going to have a question for you here in a second too. But as an outsider, what was it like dealing with other scholars in the Mormon community? You had Rick Turley as one of your outside readers. Maybe just talk about your experience in engaging other people in the scholarly community. And I tell people one of the best things about doing what I'm doing, especially when it comes to dealing with people of the Restoration, is you get to hang out with some of the nicest people in the world.
Very well said, Steve. I really can't top that one. I mean, that's been one of the great pleasures of pursuing this subject. I mean, the pleasure of discovery and understanding has been part of it. But way beyond that is the pleasure of association with all kinds of people. Like, take Joe, for example, Joe Geisner I met through the old LDS bookshelf, which was a chat group of Mormons and non-Latter-day Saints interested in the subject. And that got me into the Mormon History Association and starting going to the annual conferences, which were, I thought, fantastic. I mean, I met just absolutely terrific and welcoming people. I think most of them understood that I was a Latter-day Saint, although occasionally I would get collared by somebody who'd read an article that I'd written, and I'd be Brother McKinnon for a couple of minutes. But I found people in the Mormon History Association, which I later became president of, as extremely welcoming, bright, and helpful. And I tried to say that in my presidential address at St. George in 2011 when I signed off as president of MHA. The end of my address was a little section of the talk. I think the heading of it was something like "About You." And I described what a joy it was to be part of MHA. So through doing my research, through introductions by Will Bagley and by Artist Partial, both of whom worked with me as my researchers, through people I met on the Mormon bookshelf, like Joe, through people I met at the annual conferences, I've just met wonderful, fantastic people who are lifelong friends. I mean, I exchanged emails last night with Stan Layton, who was my editor at the Utah Historical Quarterly, starting in the mid 1970s when he went to work there, and I was working on my second article. I mean, I don't to this day know whether Stan's background is LDS or not. I mean, I don't tend to ask people that. I could probably figure it out, but in Stan's case, I don't really know. But I'm 85. He may be a little younger than that or a little older than that. But we really hit it off in a way that went way beyond editor-author relationships. And the same was true of his predecessor, Everett Cooley, who published my first article in Utah Historical Quarterly in 1963. That was quite a ways ago. And these people all became lifelong friends, even though I wouldn't see them very often. But thanks to the telephone and then the blessings of email in the late 90s, I had a lot of interactions with people like that. Polly is another one. I think I met you through MHA, Polly. I could be wrong. You're another example of all of that. So that's the short version of what you asked about my experience with interactions with Mormon historians, Steve.
That's great. Well, thank you for sharing that. And so, Joe, you actually wanted to ask a question to Bill. I also want to invite all the panelists that at the end of every discussion, if any of you do want to chime in or ask questions at the end, please feel free to be able to do that. So, Joe, what was your question?
Yeah, well, first of all, one of the joys of being friends with these folks is this little chapbook that Bill put out. He did it, I believe, right after he wrote the chapter for Writing Mormon History. And it came, this, as with all books, delays. So Bill did this booklet up, and it was a gift to various people. I just went on to see if there is even a copy of it available on Amazon or ABE Books. Nothing. So, yeah, and I don't even know how many you did, Bill. You could say how many. It's probably
It
right.
says in the back, probably 75 copies, maybe 100.
Yeah, which it's virtually impossible to find. And I'm lucky because I've got both Will Bagley's and Bill McKinnon's signature in my copy. So maybe Will signed them all as well as you. I'm not sure. My question is I think in my review of writing or of at Swords Point Volume 1, I said this is a perfect book. And so I had probably low expectations for at Source Point 2 because I wasn't sure how you could be better than a perfect book.
Confession is good for the soul, Joe.
Well,
don't hang back. I mean,
so as I'm reading at Swords Point 2, I get to the honey trap episode that Brigham Young had set up for Cummings. And I read it, and I think I read it a second time because I wanted to make sure I was actually reading accurately. And I called up Will and I said, Will, is this real? You know, I was like shocked by it. And Will goes, isn't that brilliant research? He said, when I read that, and I think Will did not read your draft. I think he read the book when it came out. So he read it like I did as with the book. And so we were both just overwhelmed at your research. I'm curious, I've never asked you this. How did you stumble upon that?
stumble is probably the right word, Joe. I mean, let me explain, but what Joe's talking about is an incident that I described in I think it was actually the second volume.
Yeah, it was. That's Swords Point 2. That's correct. Yeah.
And honey trap is a modernism. It's a phrase that's used in the intelligence services. And a honey trap is a situation that one nation sets up to ensnare potential agents to be turned against the country they're from, which is another country. The Russians used it repeatedly. The Soviets used it repeatedly. And I'm sure the CIA had its fair share of that activity also. But for example, the the Soviets would take a staffer in the American embassy in Moscow, for example, and those people would all be, for the most part, be males unaccompanied by family, and they would set up a staffer at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, get them into a compromising situation through alcohol, into a hotel room with an attractive Russian lady. Meanwhile, there'd be a two-way mirror in one wall of the hotel room with a camera on the other side, and they would film the activity, and then they would confront the staffer with the fact that they had this film, and if that person wouldn't work for the USSR as a secret agent, then the Russians would threaten to go to the US Embassy and reveal the indiscretion, which would guarantee that whoever the person involved was going to get sent home in disgrace. So that was creating a honey trap, and using it was one way that the intelligence service used for compromising people and turning them into intelligence agents operating against the government they were supposedly serving. That's what the phrase means now. And I applied it to a situation in which Brigham Young used William Staines, a horticulturalist of English birth in Salt Lake City, who owned a large home in Salt Lake City, as the operator of honey traps. Staines had a very large house, and Brigham Young tended to use his home as a guest house for visiting dignitaries. For example, when Thomas L. Kane arrived in Salt Lake City in February of 1858, he stayed at the Staines mansion. And when Alfred Cummings went back to Salt Lake City from Fort Bridger with Kane in April of 1858, he stayed in the Staines mansion also. Brigham Young enlisted Staines to monitor what these visitors were doing. Brigham Young had an insatiable appetite for intelligence. He needed information big time and wanted it on almost everything. And his reputation for doing that was fairly well known, to the point where back in Salem, Massachusetts, Albert G. Brown's mother, I mentioned Brown earlier as the New York Tribune's war correspondent in Utah, Albert Brown's mother used to have nightmares about her son, Albert, being in Utah and in proximity to the Latter-day Saints, especially Brigham Young, and she confided to her diary, which is at Radcliffe College right now, that she viewed Brigham Young as a large red spider with multiple tentacles trying to ensnare her son, Albert, in all kinds of nefarious activities. I mean, that's what Mother Brown was losing sleep about in Salem, Massachusetts during the winter of 1857-58. So Staines was commissioned by Brigham Young to monitor the activities of his guest. And in the course of Alfred Cummings, who left his wife behind at Fort Bridger when he went into Salt Lake City with Kane to negotiate with Brigham Young over the future of the Army's presence in Utah, he struck up little interactions with the serving girls in the Staines mansion's dining room. And Staines would hustle off to Brigham Young and report all this. And whether Brigham Young confronted Cummings with it or not, I never was quite sure, but he certainly knew it. And I discovered this by going through Staines' diary, in which he chatted about his reporting to Brigham Young and on what subjects. I discovered it by reading George Albert Smith's diaries and letters, where he talked about a conversation he had with General Wells, the commander of the Nauvoo Legion, and Brigham Young about what Staines was reporting, and other documents. Kane also was being monitored, and there were references to him, not about improprieties, but just what he was doing and with whom. So I became aware of it, Joe, by reading these primary sources, none of which were available to me back in the 50s when I started down this road. But by the time I got to it in the 1990s and the following decades of the 21st century were available, and I could get my hands on and read. So it's again serendipity to a certain extent. Like I forget which of those documents I read first, but when I came across it, it was kind of a uh-oh moment, like, what's this? And then it would lead me to another one and to another one. And before I knew it, I had the story of what I called the honey trap. I mean, you could argue as an historian, I shouldn't use a modernism like that for an incident that took place in 1858, but I couldn't resist the temptation, I suppose. I guess it caught your attention, right?
It did. And Wilson, I actually pointed, Lindsay Hanson Park is doing an episode on the Utah War. And I said, do you realize that Bill McKinnon did research and discovered this honey trap? And she had no idea. So I'm hoping when they do their episode, they'll include that. But this is, and I should have also commented that the first book I had written in my review, Journal of Mormon History, that your book's volume one's a perfect book. But I said to Will as well, after reading volume two, that I thought it was better than volume one. And Will himself said that as well. I don't know if and I don't think I ever shared that with you, but we both felt that that volume two was actually better.
Well, nice to know. Thank you.
Well, that was very fascinating. And Bill, I just want to thank you so much for sharing this with us today. Of course, we had you come first because you need to drop off at some point, but of course, you're welcome to stay on as long as you can to engage the conversation.
Well, I'd love to stay for the whole thing, and I'll have to double back and find out if there's a way I can watch the whole thing, but I'm going to have to depart in about 5 minutes, probably, Steve.
So, of course, you can always just go to my YouTube channel, Mormon Book Reviews, and watch it there when it's released. And
I will.
Joe will let you know when it's coming out, and we'll be sending you a link. Will send you a link to it as well. So, so thanks, Bill. That was great. Okay, so the next individual that's up actually wrote the very first chapter in the book. Her name is Polly Aird, and I just think it's really fascinating because you're another outsider that does have a Mormon background, but you were kind of engaging the history of your family and ended up getting caught up in the Mormon history world. Maybe just talk about that. What got you involved, and tell your story.
So I have never been Mormon. My parents were not Mormon, but my grandparents were not Mormon. My great-grandparents were, and had come from, on my father's side, and had come from Scotland in the 1850s, the early 1850s, to Utah, which, as all of you know, was a pretty hard journey of 7 months usually. So I didn't know anything about this background, this history of my family, I discovered when I was maybe in my 20s. I found my grandmother had written a story about her side of the family. She had been born in California, so she was not one of them, but it was based on what her mother had told her. And it was a really dramatic story. My grandmother had lived in Provo. My grandfather was a doctor there, and she had been elected to the state legislature because of her interest in education. And I guess she was quite a powerful speaker. She was president of the Prohibition Club and the women's, I don't know, a whole bunch of things. So it was a fantastic, dramatic story, and it was fun to read. But that was that. And then my father, when he retired, he was a neurologist at the University of California Medical Center in San Francisco. When he retired, he decided to take his mother's story and amplify it by giving it more context and adding in things about Mormonism, just to expand it a bit. So by that time, I had been a scientific editor for many years and was then working at Boeing as an editor, a technical editor. So he asked if I would edit it. And so I said, sure, this would be fun. So I started in on it, and it was a total patchwork. You know, a little bit of Mormon history, a little bit of Mormonism, a little bit of Scottish history, a little bit of pioneer history, and it was not stitched together well. But I got fascinated, and I have my degree from Stanford is in history. I love history, so I had some tools to know how to go about finding out more. And so I started reading books and then ordering books through interlibrary loan. And then I decided I really wanted to tell the story as much as one could find out how it really happened, what happened to this family. And what happened to them was basically that they got to Utah in the 1850s, which was a very fanatical period. Nobody should ever want to have been in Utah in the 1850s. There were locust and cricket plagues. There was a terrible winter. There were all kinds of natural disasters and famine. And there, you know, the closest place is Sacramento. So it's not as if you can run down to the store to get supplies. So those natural disasters happened. Then the handcart disasters happened when more than 200 pioneers pulling handcarts died in a snow because they started late from the frontier. And so Brigham Young then started a Reformation. He thought somehow God was displeased and the people needed to be purified. And so, but the Reformation was another really difficult time for people because men were questioned about their wives. Wives were questioned about their husbands. Some confessions were in public. They had to be rebaptized. And so it became a very stressful time. And also during the Reformation, then Brigham Young and other leaders were preaching pretty violent doctrines, including blood atonement. And blood atonement was that some sins are so egregious that the only way to atone is to have your throat slit and your blood fall to the ground. Many Mormon scholars say this is kind of hell and brimstone preaching, and yes, definitely. But on the other hand, the way I kind of looked at it was, you know, people saw Brigham Young as a literal prophet. They took the Book of Mormon literally. Why wouldn't they take what Brigham Young said literally too? And some definitely did, including the Bishop of Springville, who arranged to have a family, a father, and he wanted 2 sons killed because they had lost their faith and were trying to go to California. And so he arranged for 2 faithful members to imply that they too wanted to go to California and find out what the father's plans were. And they did. And the fellow whose the father's name was Parish, so they set out, the Parish and one of the betrayers set out of one gate out of Spanish Fork, excuse me, not Spanish Fork, Springville. And then another betrayer took the 2 boys and they went around out of another gate and met south of Springville. And then the betrayers began to stab the father. So they said later the wounds on him looked almost ritualistic, at least some of them. One of the sons was shot, and one of the betrayers was shot, mistaken for the second son. So my ancestors were living in Spanish Fork, which is 6 miles away, and they were beginning to lose their faith and then saw this happen, and they became quite alarmed. And so they didn't say anything to their neighbors, of course, but they eventually got in touch with the army, who camped at Camp Floyd on the west side of Utah Lake, and eventually asked for a protection to get out of Utah. And they were given protection. From the documents that I've been able to find in Army records, about 40 families left. And there, from what the research I've done, it looks like many more would have liked to have gotten out. But to get out meant you needed a wagon and animals and food for at least 2 months. You needed some wherewithal. And at that time, people in Utah were really, really poor. With all these disasters they had been having and famine, I mean, people were living hand to mouth. So the family did get out. The Army took them halfway across what today's Nevada to approximately Winnemucca. And then they were on the California Trail. And that was 1859. So there were still a lot of people going to California, less as gold miners, more as settlers and farmers because of California's rich land. So I had this dramatic story, and I had my grandmother's version of it. And the more research I did, the more her story was good drama, but not necessarily aligned to what actually happened. And I realized that she wrote it when she was in her 80s, and it was based on what her mother had told her, and her mother had died 40 years before. So she had kind of told a good story. But if she hadn't told that story, I would not have known anything about this family history. And so through the years, I have met many people in California, and I live in Seattle, Washington State, and I'm sure it's true in Oregon, of people who say, oh, I had Mormon ancestors. Yeah, I have some family there, but they don't know anything about them. And so I was just very fortunate. So this became a big project for me. It took me, 18 years to get it all researched and written, trips to Scotland and trips following. I took my kids and we went camping on the trail to see what it was like all the way. And well, then one trip I took with a friend after my kids were pretty grown, from Utah to follow the trail that they took to California. And we got to where they had settled, which was in a little town called Live Oak in northern Sacramento Valley, near Marysville in Yuba City. And so this friend had been with me very patiently, and so I didn't want to go. I knew that some relatives lived there, descendants of the family that had settled there, but I didn't want to impose, trying to dig up some of these people that I did not know. And but I looked up in the phone book, which there were phone books then, and looked up the strangest name that I knew was a branch of that family. And his name was Ansel Miller. So I thought there can't be more than one Ansel Miller. So I got his phone number, and when I got home, I telephoned him, and he knew who I was because actually his wife had been a patient of my father's. And he said, he kind of casually said, oh yeah, my daughter Donna has the trunk. And I said, what's the trunk? And he said, oh, well, Peter McCausland, that's all his papers. And I thought, there's a trunk? Because the problem of writing a book like a family history is, you really need somebody's voice. You need somebody to say, what they believed and why they did this, that, their motivations. And I didn't have that. I just had collected all these facts about the family. Well, so lo and behold, there was a trunk. And eventually I went down there and I corresponded with this cousin Donna quite a bit. And we transcribed all his letters and writings. And they were written on all kinds of strange pieces of paper, back of envelopes, kind of felted paper. Mice had nibbled them, so some words were missing. But we were able to construct, what the motivation was. What I wanted to know was, why had this family converted in Scotland? And then what had happened in Utah that had disillusioned them? And then what? Did they pick up with something else after Mormonism? So thanks to Peter McCausland's papers, I was able to answer those questions. So that's how I got into it. And I took early retirement from Boeing so that I could work on this because it was so intriguing. At first, I mean, Boeing has very strict rules about, working, work part-time there. But I was working in the computer science division by that time in communications. And so they had to give leeway to the computer scientists so that Microsoft didn't hire them off. And because they gave the computer scientists some leeway, they had to give the staff, the administration, some leeway. So I was able to persuade my boss that I could work just 3 days a week. But then I found even that wasn't enough. I wanted time. And so I finally took early retirement, and so I could really get into it. So that's my story.
Wow, that's great. It's so funny because as you're engaging this history, that there's a lot of it was filtered through the lens of writing it later in life, and also that your was great grandmother was also kind of influenced by anti-Mormon literature, which would have kind of influenced the story and kind of exaggerated certain things, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It was my grandmother, not my great.
I'm sorry.
My grandmother. Yeah, I mean, she grew up in the she was born in the 1860s. So in the 1880s, 90s, I mean, and early 1900s, Sherlock Holmes stories, and there were just a whole bunch of them out there that were very anti-Mormon. And her mother, who had been one of the ones to escape, was really angry at the Mormons. I think just felt that they had been led there under false pretenses, and they didn't know about polygamy when they set sail from Liverpool. And so she was really angry, and my grandmother took that on. And then my father was also very prejudiced against the Mormons. And this is a little embarrassing, but the first trip I took to Salt Lake City in the Seattle airport, I was embarrassed to sit under the departure sign that said Salt Lake City. I thought, oh, people are going to think I'm Mormon. And then I really thought, I mean, this is stupid, Polly. People go to Utah to ski or to hike or to see all the wonderful parks, and there are more and more businesses there. And so I finally decided, look, I don't need to carry this prejudice down a third generation. That's ridiculous. And like Bill, I have found Mormons, everybody I have met have been very welcoming and considerate. When I first went to the church archives, I thought, well, they're not going to let me in. I'm doing a story about defectors, people who leave the faith. It's not faith promoting. But I decided I would just tell them that I'm not interested in bashing the church. I just wanted to know what happened to this family. And so I was very open with them. And goodness, they couldn't have been more welcoming. And I developed all kinds of theories about why, including that Mormons are really nice people, and they are. And then I thought, well, maybe the people in the archives, they're historians, they're Mormons because they have to be to work there, but they're historians, and maybe they're intrigued by the history that I'm digging up. And then I thought maybe they feel the truth will not hurt the church. And they felt I was doing a fair job. And then I finally thought, oh, no, of course, they're hoping I'll see how wonderful it all is and become a Mormon. And later on, I was telling Paul Anderson, Lavina's husband, these theories, and he just laughed at me and he said, Holly, you can't imagine how wonderful it is to have an outsider interested in our history. And so I finally decided all those things are true to some extent.
Oh, that's great. I love it. It's wonderful to be able to talk to two outsiders at the beginning, me, of course, being an outsider as well. I'm just curious, Polly, as you were doing your research and engaging, did you ever have any dealings with Gerald and Sandra Tanner in their research?
No, I know their book, and I used it occasionally for references, but I was not into Mormon theology. and outside of what Brigham Young was preaching in the 1850s. That's really as close as I got. And the motivations for conversion in Scotland, what Mormonism represented to those working class Scots having a really hard time in Scotland during the Industrial Revolution. So what was preached to them by the missionaries, yes, I did that, and then what happened in Utah, what Brigham Young and saying that Adam was God and lived on a planet. I mean, I got into that a little bit, but otherwise it was more the events that happened and the difficulties they faced.
Wow, yeah,
and
I
how they
think,
reacted.
just think
One thing that did impress me was that these people knew that it would be hard to get out, and yet, well, they felt threatened, whether their perception was danger, whether it really was or not, no telling. But 6 months after the parish murders came Mountain Meadows Massacre, and that was another, horrible atrocity that scared them to death.
it is almost biblical, this period of time in Mormonism, from the martyrdom of the prophet in 1844 to the trek, to all the disasters that happened, to having blood atonement and having the Mormon Reformation. This was a very tumultuous time, and of course the Utah War. This is an extraordinary tumultuous time for the saints in Utah, and really, in many ways, that period of time still reverberates to the modern times. And so it's very fascinating to also hear a perspective of people who left, which often is even mentioned. And what was mentioned in your article was that people are like, what interest would there be in people that left the church, right? But of course, that's an important story that needs to be told as well, to get a complete picture of the Mormon pioneer experience.
It's true, Steve. Yeah.
Well,
and, I found Mormon historians who are Mormons naturally are not interested in that side of things. They're more interested in things that, the faithful and the good people that were there. So there was a niche for me.
Right. I love it. I love it. Well, it's great. I'm just glad that you're able to tell your story. And before we move on to the next panelist, I just want to open it up. Does anybody have any questions for Polly or any comments about what she just talked about?
I would just comment that I remember Polly's Journal of Mormon History article when it came out, and I'm trying to remember the name, Polly, but it's the parish porter murders.
Yes, yeah.
Is it clear? What is it? It's clear out.
It has, yes, let's see.
It's a quote. It's a Brigham Young quote.
It's a Brigham Young quote. Clear out, you nasty apostates.
Yeah, that's it. Clear out, you nasty apostates. Yes, yes. And I remember when that came out, and people were blown away. First of all, everybody was wondering, who is this Polly Aird who can write about this? And second of all, how groundbreaking it was, because nothing really had come out at that point. Artist Partial's article had not come out. Will Bagley's Blood of the Prophets hadn't come out. Bill McKinnon's Lonely Bones hadn't come out. None of that. And yours was a groundbreaking article.
Yeah. So in that article, I think it was 6 or 7 people who had left Utah in the 1850s, and tried to parse out why they had left. What was it that had, each one had driven them out? And so, and whether, how they perceived danger, or whether they didn't have danger. At least one of them just left. And then it was Lavina Fielding Anderson, who I was about to leave on a trip to Italy, and she called me, because she was editing the journal at the time, and she said, "So tell me more about this parish potter murder." And so I told her, and she said, "Well, you have to write that." And I said, "Lavina, I'm leaving." She said, "No, you have to write it." So I scrambled, and I mean, I had all the material. I just had it made the article nearly 100 pages long, and so I just kept thinking she'll never do this. I mean, who has an article 100 pages? I said, do you want me to put it in a second article? No, I want it in this article. And you're right, that actually, if you go into, what is it, Google Scholar or something like that, that's the article that gets most quoted from of all the writings I've done.
Fascinating. Well, I think one of the most important things that this channel is able to do is able to make Mormon scholarship and history accessible to a lay audience. And so what might be something that was groundbreaking paper within the scholarly community, it's well known, but I think it's really important that we get this research and and all this stuff out to the general public for those of you who are lay people who are interested in the history of Mormonism. And Polly, I just want to thank you and honor you for the tremendous work that you have done in this field.
Well, thank you very much.
So I am really, Joe, this is going really good. I really appreciate you putting this all together. This is really great. I'm having fun. I love Mormon history and scholarship, and I love all the people that are involved, including my friend, Brian Hales, who we've been talking now for a while about having you come on the program. And I was pleasantly surprised that you were going to be joining us. And I didn't find out until late last night. So I actually got to engage your chapter this morning in preparation for this interview. And Brian, I think, what's so fascinating to me is that, as you open up the chapter, you're going to school and you have a relative that basically becomes a Mormon fundamentalist, or what we call a polygamist, which then kind of piqued your interest in the study of Mormon polygamy and the theology of polygamy and all this kind of stuff, and doing it from a faithful perspective. So maybe just talk about how that, what really was, of course, that was the impetus, but really what really got you engaged, and then how did it really stick its claws in you to want you to continue the journey of studying polygamy? And of course, you have a fascinating life and a fascinating story to tell. But just talk about your journey as you studied the history of polygamy in Mormonism.
Wow, that's a big question, and I appreciate the opportunity to be on this. Steve, you're very kind and Joe to invite me, and I feel that a privilege to contribute to the book. Joe, thank you so much. And writing the history of that was an enjoyable experience because there isn't a single footnote in the entire chapter. And of course, those of us that write are used to having to worry about a lot of footnotes. But back in 1989, a family member was joined the FLDS. Well, it was the Allred group, but it was a fundamentalist LDS group. Her husband practiced polygamy, and they invited me, and I read their literature. They kindly shared it with me, and I had lots of questions. And of course, our family was concerned, my parents and everything. And so there was a motivation there to try to figure this out. And I also wondered if it was right for me. I was not really impressed with any of the stuff I was reading from them, but a member of my family was involved, so I took it quite seriously. But I quickly realized that there had been no history about the Mormon fundamentalists written. And Max Anderson had written a very church-oriented criticism of what they believed, but no history had been written. So I jumped in and had a lot of fun as a pure amateur, and then took the manuscript to Greg Colford, who has Lavina Fielding Anderson, whose name has come up a number of times. Lavina is just such an amazing person, and she was the editor, and that book never could have been readable with my writing skills at that time. And Lavina, I remember, and she edited some of the other volumes, but periodically she'd write no more passive verbs and things that I didn't even know what she's talking about. I was just trying to get words out there. So but thanks to Lavina, we published a book that was well received on the history of the Mormon fundamentalists. But a lot of people were asking me questions about Joseph Smith, and it was Alex Baugh, a dear friend, said, the most popular chapter in your book is the first chapter where you give a short compilation of Nauvoo polygamy and the history behind Joseph Smith and the introduction of plural marriage. And so in 2007, I thought, wow, we could use an updated history or any history on Joseph Smith that's beyond a chapter. Or Todd Compton's book was very useful, and his scholarship was amazing, but that was, you know, mid-90s, and here we are over 10 years later, and things are opening up. And I will say, while I was researching with the church history department, I met with the historians there. They never denied me access to anything. There was Clayton's journal that I wanted to read, the original, and Elder Jensen, who was a church historian, says we don't have it. It's in the First Presidency's vault, and I put this in my chapter. But I thought to myself at that moment, well, could you ask him for me? You know, would you get this William Clayton's journal so I can look at it? And it never happened. But and other historians had seen it because they were quoting from it, but my credentials were not very great. Being an anesthesiologist gives you no credibility in academia, and but we worked around it. They were able to verify with the transcript that they had that the quotes I were using from George D. Smith's transcript were accurate, and so we worked through that. But I was able to hire Don Bradley, who is an amazing researcher, and he was able to go out for 2 years, and I paid him a weekly wage, and it wasn't what he was worth, I'm sure, but he was able to gather things, and he went back to Yale twice, and all up and down, and when we published the books in 2013, the question was, did we miss much? You know, what did we miss? And yet here we are over 10 years later, and well, there are a handful of things I would have included, but Don was amazing. And so we were able to include most everything. There's just not a lot of other primary sources, and I've talked with friends at the Joseph Smith Papers Project and about things they found when doing their volumes, and they're really we've been very fortunate. One of them said, "Yeah, I doubt there's going to be anything new unless it comes from a private collection that really is on this." And I've made these available just for the audience on MormonPolygamyDocuments.org. I uploaded everything I got from Don and lots of other sources. So if somebody wants to see the data that I use to put the volumes together, they're all available there. But with Don's help, and again, Lavina edited the first 2 volumes. It just did an amazing job. But she's probably pulling her hair out over and over. But we had a good experience there, and we're able to produce those 2 volumes, and then a 3rd volume on the theology. And I'm an amateur historian. I'm an amateur theology non-expert, I guess you would say, but all the data is there. A theologian, yeah, thank you. And the data is there, and so people can look at it. And I am a believer. You know, I appreciate what Joe said. I'm not an advocate of polygamy, and that's not what you said, Joe. But I am a believer in Joseph Smith, and yet I don't like polygamy. I don't defend it. I would not want to practice it here. I think it would be very hard. And but as a believer, people will call me an apologist sometimes, and I get that. But the real thing I wish that people would call me is a transparency. That's not really a word, but you know what I mean. I think all the data out there will leave room for us all to understand what happened, at least through our own lenses, and prevent people from spinning the evidence. I don't want to spin it, although we know everybody spins it. Nobody's totally objective, but you get what I mean. I think in the data, if we can just get all of the documents out there, make them available, which is what I've tried to do. I think the Joseph Smith Papers Project is doing that. People can at least understand what happened. It doesn't mean we have to like it. I don't like polygamy, but at least understand it. And I think in that setting, there's lots of room for different forms of interpretation, including one that includes that which I possess, which is one that maintains a belief in Joseph. So I don't know. Did I cover in a basic way, Steve, what you were hoping for?
Yeah, and of course, I just actually, you know, Don Bradley's a very good friend of mine, and I really appreciated how much you talked about the work that Don did. I think it really, Don is a really important contributor in this space, and he really is just a good soul. And I think that he's one of the best people I've ever met. And it was a real surprise. I didn't realize the extent of his involvement on your project. It must feel like a real privilege to work with somebody with the likes of Don Bradley.
Well, Don is an interesting guy and a dear friend. And you know, at the time we were working together, he had already resigned from the church. I didn't know that. I knew he didn't go to church because we'd meet on Sunday mornings down in Salt Lake, because I was down there for some other things, and he'd come in his Levi's, and he wasn't always that. Hair wasn't always combed exactly. Anyway, you know, he just looked like a scholar who was just busy with scholarship and not less concerned about other things. And yet he was producing, you know, really remarkable documents and finding things. And what would happen is during the daytime, you know, when I could at my work or at home at night, I'd read what had been written. I bet I spent more time in Todd Compton's book than even his editor did. And Mike Quinn, I shouldn't mention names because there's so many, but all of these people have written on polygamy, and I would read them and I would extract their footnotes and send them to Don and said, go find this document and let's get the original. Let's quote the original. And we were able to do that in almost every case. There's probably a handful of quotes that I had to do secondarily, but didn't want to. And yeah, Don couldn't find it. And so we went with that. But yeah, Don was just dedicated to trying to figure this out. And then for those who may be curious, 6 months after we were done, and I still didn't know that he was out of the church when we were finished in 2009, but he called me 6 months later and said, "Hey, I'm getting rebaptized." So an interesting pathway for him. And I just talked to him last night about some other project he's working on. He's just amazing. But yeah, he's doing well.
That's great. Yeah, it was actually a real privilege to, when I first started the channel, to actually go to Don's apartment and interview him and have him tell his story of coming back into faith, but also talking about the Lost 116 Pages book, which is a brilliant book in my mind. Well, Brian, it begs the question, because honestly, over the course of the last few years, there has been this rise of what people refer to as polygamy denial. And you have been kind of a person who's been really engaging and studying this. And how important is it that we get the history right? You've been documenting this. You've done a ton of research. What are your thoughts about this rising movement of polygamy denial?
Yes, there are members in the church with big websites and podcasts and everything. And they are saying that either Joseph didn't do it, and they're adopting the line of the RLDS church during the most of the 20th century and the 19th century, or they're adopting today the fundamentalist RLDS position. The Price is taken and compiled a great deal of data. And it surprises me. And yet there's so much irony there, because how do you combat with historical documentation someone who says Joseph wasn't a polygamist? Well, you pull out the testimonials and the affidavits and you know the depositions, and you have dozens and dozens of sources. And what is the message? The message is Joseph was a polygamist. Well, that's a really bad message in the 21st century. Polygamy is not going to be well received. And so either the false message that he wasn't a polygamist is by our standards inaccurate, and yet to confront that describes Joseph as a polygamist, and 99% of the people who hear that are going to think this is libido driven, you know, and they'll accept all of the claims against this, and they aren't going to get into details, which I think allow those of us who think he was not necessarily libido driven. Although I honestly, to be real frank, I think once the angel came the third time in February 42, I think Joseph just says, this is a privilege I have, and I'm going to exercise it. But prior to that, I do believe that the story that he told, that this was something God wanted, we don't know why. And so, but all of that in a 21st century setting is just going to make Joseph look worse. I mean, Joseph isn't going to win on either side of this discussion, at least in the minds of most of those who are listening. And so there's irony there, to my mind, that church members are advocating a false narrative, but to combat it, you've got to talk about something that's really distasteful to most people, and understandably so.
Yeah, it is a bit of a catch-22. And of course, when you think about how that in the narratives that both the RLDS and the LDS church taught for a very long time, whether officially or unofficially, the RLDS, of course, denied that Joseph Smith committed polygamy up until relatively recently, historically speaking. And of course, there was also the line taught within the LDS church. It was really Brigham Young that started it, and many, and actually I'm surprised there's a large percentage of regular, members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints that grew up not knowing that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy. So it's really kind of, we have to get the history right, and we're kind of combating the narratives that these two churches kind of presented as well. Maybe speak to that.
No, that's a great insight, and it is true that most members did not know until the Gospel Topic essays came out, and had been out for a few years, that Joseph Smith had plural wives, and I have traced that. I'm trying to figure out why was the church kind of caught flat-footed, or without having maybe taught everything that the members might have benefited from before the internet was able to put it right in our home, our living rooms. And I traced it back to about the 1930s and 40s, I believe, and I can't prove this, but Heber J. Grant, who was really ticked off at the Mormon Fundamentalists, who were getting lots of media. I mean, if you look at Life magazine in the 1940s, 50s, there's full page spreads and things about the fundamentalists down on the Utah-Arizona border, FLDS, they later became, and showing them. And I think Heber J. Grant was just not happy with that. He said, we're a monogamous church, we're not doing polygamy, and we're not going to do anything with it. And with that sentiment, or maybe an unwritten policy, I think the church just didn't do anything with polygamy. It didn't want to talk about it. The historians didn't want to deal with it. Joseph Fielding Smith, of course, was in charge of the historian's office for all those decades. And if he didn't want the church really to be worrying about polygamy, then it wasn't going to be out there. I mean, there were a few isolated references, John A. Woodsoe and others who did some things, and Joseph Fielding Smith wrote, of course, Blood Atonement and the Origin of Plural Marriage, but there wasn't much taught, and it didn't reach into curriculum, and seldom mentioned in the general conference, and so when the internet hits in the 2000s, 2010, we find that members really are learning things they didn't know, things that are true, and it might have been useful that they had been, advised about these things ahead of time, and that they felt betrayed, understandably. And yet I don't think there was any actual desire to censor our history. It was just a policy that went forward without anybody really evaluating how this might work in the future.
Interesting. And I do want to refer people to my various interviews that I've done regarding Reuel Allred, having his granddaughter come on the program, as well as having Ann Wild come on to talk about Ogden Kraut, two very, very important 20th century Mormon fundamentalists. And I'm really proud of the work that we were doing to get those people's names and stories out to the general public as well. And Brian, I want to thank you for finally getting on Mormon Book Reviews. It's been a pleasure. And I just want to open this up. Joe or anybody, do you have any questions or comments for Brian?
Well, two things. One is Brian deserves so much credit and appreciation of ours. His making his research documents available. In fact, I actually, Brian, I downloaded last night it was the I think the German newsletter for missionaries off of your website, and just how important of a resource you have. It had some obscure thing about Ervil LeBaron in this newsletter. And the other thing I was fascinated, I don't know if you've looked at Cheryl Bruno's new anthology that Signature Books will be coming out with, maybe at about the same time as Writing Mormon History too. But your influence is seen throughout the work that's being done on polygamy. And I thought, as I was reading the chapter headings, my first thought was the amount of influence that you have, Brian, on what's being done is quite impressive.
Well, you're very kind, and again, I'm indebted to Don Bradley, because we were able to get the documents out there so people can go forward. I'm so excited to see this anthology, and what Don Bradley was talking to me last night about was that Rick Turley is writing a biography of Joseph Smith, and they're taking some new views on plural marriage. Some that may disagree with the thesis that I put together, and I think that's great. Transparency and all, and I have read Todd Compton's essay that'll be in that book, and he and I respectfully see differently on polyandry, but I do have an article coming out in the next few weeks in the Journal of Mormon History on polyandry that I think expands the discussion, and I'll be interested to see how that goes. But no, this is wonderful stuff.
Well, that's great, Brian. And you know what? Let's get you back on, because I have about a half dozen more questions I have for you. Of course, with this whole polygamy controversy that's going on, I could go a lot of different directions, and also some really interesting insights that I've picked up watching you on Gospel Tangents and reading your materials. I think you are a very important voice in the restoration.
You're very kind, but thank you for having me, and for everybody listening to me here. These are great scholars, and I don't feel like I belong here, but thank you for letting me be here.
That's great. Now, I want to encourage everybody who can stick around, or if you got to go, we understand as well, because we have to be respectful of everybody's time as well. So now we're down to our final two, Susan Staker and Daniel Stone. Now, let me just ask, is there one of you that needs to, just to be respectful of your time, do either one of you have a time constraint here that maybe you'd want to go? Okay, you're fine, Daniel. So, well, I'd say we got to do ladies first then. And so we're going to have talk to Susan Staker, who, by the way, an accidental historian, and but also a wonderful human being that I've been able to engage. And I'm really excited to have you come on and talk about your engaging Mormon history, and just talk a little bit about. And then what was so cool is that, you know, you kind of just accidentally, like you said, got into it, partly because you needed a job. So you started working part-time at the church history department. And then, of course, you got involved with Signature, as well as various other things. Signature books. What was the other one? I forget. But either way, I just talk about your engagement with Mormon history, and especially during a period of time in which it was the Leonard Arrington era, and you being a woman engaging Mormon history, which was really groundbreaking at the time.
Okay. First, I want to plug Cheryl's book. I have an essay in that book on Abraham and Sarah as avatars for Joseph and Emma. And Don also has a couple of essays there. He and I end up working on a lot of the same things. I just hung out with him a couple of weeks back when I was in Utah. Turns out we're both writing right now about Joseph and Oliver. So he's always, like I say to him, he's such a great researcher. He's such a great reader. And then when we come to the so what, we tend to part company and have wonderful conversations and arguments. But I do want to plug Cheryl's book, which is really fabulous. So I was sort of primed already, thinking back when Joe asked about coming on this podcast, because I had just finished reading Michael Quinn's memoir. And actually, the very last time I hung out with Mike Quinn was with Joe Geisner. We were at a conference at the Bancroft in Pasadena on the First Vision just before COVID descended. And that was the last time I saw Mike. The first time I saw Mike was in the fall of 1969. I was a freshman at BYU, just come from southeastern Idaho. And in the honors program that fall, I had two classes with a handsome young new returned missionary, also an English major like me, named Dennis Quinn. And the two we had a German class, but we also had a US history class, like 101 from Ted Warner. And I would have to say that's the last formal US history class I ever took. It certainly was not the last one that Dennis Quinn, who turned himself into Michael Quinn over the next decade, took. It was interesting to read Michael's memoir, because obviously I've been intertwined in a lot of serendipitous ways with Mike's career over a long period. And reading what Mike had to say about Leonard's history, Camelot, sent me back to thinking about that period, because I was very lucky. My husband at that time, Richard Oman, was, when we came in the mid-70s, became employed in the church history department to work on the church museum. His background was in art history. There he worked with Paul Anderson. I knew Levina. I actually met Levina. Actually, I met Michael Quinn in 1965, not 1969. I met Levina in 1969 at BYU. So I had a long history with Levina as well. So anyway, Richard was working in the church historical department. I had a couple of young kids and was sort of going crazy, stir crazy. I wanted some part-time work. And so he actually got me into working at the historical department at that point with Mike was there. I met Peggy Fletcher there. I was hired to work with Jill Mulvey to become Durr, and Maureen Orsenbach, I think it is, to become Beecher. I was hired as a research assistant for them. And, you know, it was interesting for me to put the work I was hired to do into the context that Mike gave in his very robust discussion of the church history department in his memoir, because there had been, you know, there were big plans for publishing a whole variety of books. And initially, I believe they were to be published through Deseret Book. And interestingly enough, the project I was hired to work on was probably one of the only ones that actually slipped through. I was hired to work with Jill, who had been assigned to work on a history of the primary, which is the children's organization. And I sort of expect it slipped through. I mean, what would have had less attention from the general authorities at that time than women and children, right? So I was hired to do research on that. And it was amazing. I mean, it truly was at the church history department. You just like walked into the stacks, rummaged around, took things back to your desk. And I started working on the primary. And it was fascinating because I was assigned like the first half. It was for 100 years. So I was assigned the first half. And it turned out that the first half comprised the presidency of two women, neither of whom had children, and two women who lived together most of their adult lives. One was Louis Felt. She was a polygamous wife with no children. May Anderson was a single convert from England who never married, never had children. And, you know, one of the most fabulous things I found when I was researching the primary was an article in the Children's Friend from something like 1905 or something, or early 1900s, that was called The David and Jonathan of the Primary. And that article described Louis Felt and May Anderson sitting in bed together, thinking about all of the wonderful issues of the primary. And in that, Louis Felt told the story of how she came to call May Anderson to the primary. She was having to do a lot of traveling around the territory, and she was lonely, didn't like to travel alone. And so she thought, if I call May, then she can travel with me. And so she called May Anderson to the primary board so that they could travel together when they visited the primaries. And it's an amazing story because the first, from the 1870s into the 1940s, those two women ran the primary. And May Felt was a contemporary and a collaborator with Amy Brown Lyman. I was just reading about her last night in Ben Parker's new book. And together they did an amazing number of things, including the Primary Children's Hospital and all the things they did together. So anyway, this was the research I got to do. It's fabulous. I finished doing my research. I took it to Jill, and she said, well, why don't you start writing it up? She was working on a lot of stuff. So I wrote up the first 50 years, and I took it to Jill, and she, amazingly enough, took it to Leonard Arrington. And I would have to say that one of the dirty little secrets from that period is that, like, research assistants like me research things, wrote things up, and then the major historians put their name on them and published them, which would have been an easy thing for Jill to do. But what she did is she went to Leonard and she said, Susan's written this manuscript. It's great draft. I think her name should go on the book. And it did, which was amazing. I was like a nobody, but it went on the book. I have to show you, here is the book. And it was published through Deseret Book. And as part of the review, it went to Laverne Parmley, who was the primary children's president at the time, the prime, and it went to Boyd K. Packer. Now, of course, I can't imagine Boyd spent a lot of time reading that book. Again, women and children, blah, blah, blah. But his comment did come back. This looks like the women were doing this on their own. You need to show that the men were there, all the time. Well, it was like, okay. So I went back and looked for the men, but I would have to say the men paid virtually no attention to the primary until like the kind of first round of correlation in something like the 40s. But, where we could, we added in a couple of things. But again, I think it was so under the radar, it just went to publication. And so it's a really odd book since it was published through Deseret Book, but it really does go into the context of that time when there were all those books that were going to be published. And I look back at that, I'm very proud that I was able to work on that book, and it has that lovely story of May Anderson and Louis Felt in it, and that's one of the stories that Michael later picked up on in his same-sex book, looking at that kind of relationship and the different context there was for a relationship like that in the 19th century. So after I finished that book.
Well, and just real quick, Susan, just real quick. So this is, the name of the book is called Sisters and Little Saints, and it was published by Deseret. It is fascinating, because obviously reading in between the lines, within the context of the LGBTQ community, I think they would probably find this to be an interesting book. But also what's also interesting is that you pointed out about how much control these women had over the primary. It reminds me that even into the 1930s, the Relief Society was a relatively independent organization in which the women did publish their materials. So there was a lot more freedom afforded to people in back then before correlation happened. Maybe speak to that.
Yeah, the women had their own budgets. They just ran things. And like I say, May Anderson and Amy Brown Lyman were kind of partners in crime from the early, the women really started getting involved in national movements, even like the kindergarten movement. And then things that happened during World War I, and then the whole social, Amy Brown Lyman started a sort of like taught the women sociology to go out and figure out the problems that were going on. And they started the Welfare Society, or whatever it's called now. And May Anderson built the Primary Children's Hospital, and they did those pretty independently. They raised the money. The women had their own buildings. They had their own publications. And it was very distressing to them when the men started paying attention and started taking away the independence of those organizations. I mean, I was lucky to write about the period when there was such independence. And I think the primary, even more than the Relief Society, was so under the screen that nobody really much paid attention. And like May Anderson has to be, I mean, she is like underappreciated. Amy Brown Lyman always gets the attention, but May Anderson was an amazing, independent, unusual woman. And like I say, she was never married, lived her whole adult life until Louis Felt was older. And so she died in the early 19th century. So after that, May was single.
Fascinating. So continue your journey here. So you, of course, you got involved in the journals of Wilfred Woodruff, and wrote a book called Waiting for World's End. Very interesting perspective. And of course, you also are involved in telling Joseph Smith's story as well. Maybe just speak to those.
Yeah, well, after I quit working at the church, I mean, my next project, which I really loved, is I got to work with Hal Cannon on Utah folk art. And this was the first book I ever edited. This is the catalog for a show on Utah folk art that we put together. And I had this amazing experience where I was given a year, something like almost a year, to research Utah folk art. And what I would do is I would go into little towns in southern Utah, and I would find whoever was in charge of the Daughters of the Pioneer Museum. And they would unlock their thing, and there would be all these amazing articles. And I went all over the state, and then they would like put me together with people because I was looking for things for the show. I have to say, one of the really evil things that Hal did for this show is at that point, the Daughters of the Utah Pioneer was still being ruled, and I say ruled, by Kate Carter, who's another amazing person. But what happened is when you donated something to the Daughters of the Utah Pioneers, you actually signed a covenant that said those artifacts would never leave the confines of a DUP museum. Well, Hal had gone and tried to get Kate Carter to let us, rework that covenant, and she said no. So what Hal did under the better to get forgiveness than permission, like we went to all these little places and we'd give them this, sales pitch. My goodness, you can take this and it'll be Utah, and it's going to travel to 2 other places, and there's going to be this beautiful book, and it's going to be full of photographs of all your stuff. And we managed to get a whole bunch of artifacts from the DUP into the show. I mean, one thing that Hal had me do is look for beehives, which was really interesting. We did a whole section on beehives, and then he later did a whole show on beehives. But probably my favorite thing, 2 of my favorite things I found a butter mold from Orderville, which was like this big, huge butter mold, like because it was for communitarian consumption. And then like in a pile of stuff in the Ogden DUP, I found this amazing all-seeing eye, this huge wooden all-seeing eye, which was almost identical to the one that was originally on the old tabernacle in Utah. So anyway, I did that. It was fabulous. That got finished. I ended up getting a job with Peggy at Sunstone and was there during an amazing period. In fact, I had to smile, Michael. One of the things that happened during that period when Mike was starting to have his big fights with Boyd Kay, he gave the speech about historians at BYU, which was, you know, kind of the beginning of the end for him. And I went down there for Sunstone to kind of cover that. And near the end of reading his article, Michael broke down and he couldn't continue reading. And he actually asked me to come up and finish reading the article, which I did. And he actually put that in his memoir. I thought that was sweet. So I worked it, and then I decided that I wanted to go back to graduate school. I thought about going into history since I've been doing so much history, but I ended up going in, getting a PhD in English literature. And one of my specialities was narrative theory. So I think what ended up happening over the next decade or so is I found a way of marrying my accidental historian self and my narratologist self. When I started graduate school, I moved to Signature, which has much better, book deadlines are much better than crazy Sunstone magazine deadlines if you're a graduate student. So I did that. And what I would do, so I had like all these jobs, you know, because by that time I was a single mother and I was trying to keep things together. So I would take on extra jobs at Signature. One thing I remember is I indexed books and they were doing this essential series. And I always think back on indexing Orson Pratt's, you know, vegetable spirits and all that kind of stuff, coming up with categories for the index. But one thing I did, which was insane, I didn't know how insane it was at the time. I signed up to do an index for Wilford Woodruff's journals. Now, at that point, all there was a typescript that had been printed, like, I don't know, 12 volumes or something. And so I had a printed thing and I had Excel. And I started working on this index. And I was horrified to find out that Wilford Woodruff doesn't even spell his own name the same. You know, he has variations on his own name. So that was a horrifying project, which was in the background of my life. My kids tell me they remember me with my computer and Wilford Woodruff for years. And when I finally finished that index, you know, Gary said, Susan, you and Tom Alexander are probably the only people on the face of the earth that have read Wilford Woodruff's diaries at least 5 to 10 times. Said, why don't you do a single volume? So that's what I did. There it is, Waiting for World's End. It was a single volume of Wilford Woodruff's diaries. And I think it's still in publication after all these years. I, of course, never got rich off of it if I was paid to do the thing. But it is one of the things I'm really proud of. And I have to say, my introduction to that book, Gary and Ron always told me, is one of the most complained about things that they've ever published. Because given the fact that like this was used in Sunday school classes and stuff, my introduction was not smiled upon. And it turned out to be the one thing where I, you know, during the 90s, and I must proudly say I edited almost everything everybody got excommunicated for. During the 90s, the one time when I'd first moved to California and married my second husband, the one time that I had anybody come after me from the church, and they sent my poor bishop and stake president there, and I hadn't even gone to church, to talk to me about my writings. It turns out was this introduction and the article that I wrote about Wilford and David Koresh. I understand that's kind of an extravagant comparison that I was called on the carpet for. And I just politely said, no, I don't think I want to come talk about my writings. That was the end of it. So that was it. I have to say the last project I worked on for Signature is what sort of led me into working on Joseph myself. The last project I worked on for Signature was David Berger's Mystery of Godliness. And what that book amounted to, what I did for that book was, at that point, David wasn't really involved. I put together his dialogue articles, and then based on like this huge treasure trove Gary had, I added in a lot of firsthand information about the endowment and the temple ceremony in Nauvoo. And working on that book, I was getting more and more interested in Joseph and seeing ways my background in narrative theory could like set me up to write about Joseph. And at some point I said, stop, Susan, you don't want to write this book for David Berger. You need to write it for yourself. And so I finished up the book, and that was actually the beginning of my work on Joseph. At that point, I was an ABD from the University of Utah. And I made the decision, actually, since it was clear I wasn't going into academia, to, instead of finishing my dissertation, to start working on Joseph Smith. And I did that. It was interrupted for some 15 years while I worked at Adobe Systems. And then I retired in order to kind of work on Joseph, which I've been doing ever since. It's hard to explain to my neighbors here on Whidbey Island what it is I'm doing. I usually spend about 30 minutes avoiding getting to the fact that, oh yes, I spend all day, every day with Joseph Smith.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see what's going to be coming out, because some of the stuff that you talk about in the chapter is really fascinating, and giving some information about Joseph Smith. I'm really excited to engage your work regarding Joseph Smith.
Yeah, you know, the thing that I found out is that I did a draft, and that's part of the problem. My draft was, I did it over a period of years. It's like 1,200 pages, you know, following Joseph's, what I call the dictation plot of Joseph's stuff, kind of following through on his use of biblical characters and seer characters. And it's too big to publish as a book, and it's too much of a discovery draft. And so I started working to revise, but I realized, given how old I am and how hard it is for independent scholars, that I really needed to get stuff out there. So what I've been doing with my project since then is trying to publish articles so that there's a footprint of my work in public. And that's kind of what I'm doing now. I published, you know, a couple of articles over the last couple of years. I've got this one coming out, and I've been giving presentations in public venues, and I'm kind of working on filling those out. So I feel like in the end, if I publish those articles, that's better than having this fabulous, wonderful book that I may die before I finish, given my completist approach to everything. Like, yeah.
Interesting. Well, I think this is really a fascinating history to talk, and you as a female experiencing some of the most important events in Mormon historical scholarship, to be there as a witness and and as a participant in it as well. Must have been, it's just really, I admire you, and the work, your history is really astonishing to me. And I want to thank you for sharing this.
Well, like I say, working at Signature and editing all those books gave me a background in Mormon history. It was amazing, because like I say, all those books people got X for, you know, Maxine Hanks, Mike Quinn, the Toscanos, Janice Allred. I edited all of those books. And so I just feel like I've had this amazing luck at being a close-up viewer of this whole process of Mormon history. And like I say, it really came back to me so strongly reading Michael's work and watching his arc and thinking where I was at that point, since we were, you know, we've known each other for so long.
Wow, that's great. Yeah. Praise to Michael Quinn. What a great historian he was. And it's a shame that I never had the opportunity to meet him. And so I wanted to open this up for the rest of my panelists. Do you have any questions or comments for Susan?
Just a quick comment. Susan is given some of the most insightful writings, particularly on Joseph Smith. Susan wrote an article, and I don't. Susan can correct me if it's the Parish but I don't think it is. I think it's another piece that she wrote for Sunstone, and she talks about a quote from Wilford Woodruff's journal about Joseph Smith. And Joseph Smith talks about the essence of life, and it's about new things, and he gets bored, and it's an extremely insightful self-reflection of Joseph Smith to Wilford Woodruff. Thank goodness Wilford Woodruff recorded, and then Susan gives
that was in both that introduction and the David Koresh article, which kind of built on that.
Okay, so it's in both.
Called on the carpet board. Yes.
Yeah, it's in both, and it's when I gave the quote to Joseph Johnston 20 some years ago or whatever it was, he said this may be the most insightful thing ever written about Joseph Smith, meaning what Susan had written. And I remember when I posted it in a group setting, and Susan read that, and she thought, "Oh, that's true. I did write that." And the other is a chapter that she wrote. I believe it's American Apocrypha, about lying for the Lord, and it's about the Book of Abraham. And yeah, right there, perfect, Steve. And but Susan discusses the Abraham and Sarah going into Egypt, and that Abraham lies and says that Sarah's his wife and our sister and not his wife, and that how that plays into Joseph Smith. Again, amazing. I mean, when I read that, Scott Kinney sent me a copy of that right after you had given it, and I read that and I was like, wow, this was something.
Well, it's interesting, that essay, which was is the first I published on Joseph, is the most quoted article if you go look of the stuff I've written. And it's sort of interesting that for this polygamy thing that's coming up, I've gone back and looked at the whole Abraham Sarah story along the arc of Joseph's career. So that little piece is in there, but it's interesting where else that led me.
And I'm just talking off the top of my head, but isn't this kind of like the revision of the Abraham Sarah story, in which the biblical story is that Abraham lied, but then in the book of Abraham, God told Abraham to lie. Is that correct?
Right. And plus God is the one that says Sarah is a very fair woman to look upon, and he actually adds very to Genesis.
Yeah, it's a brilliant piece of writing. Brilliant piece of writing, Susan.
Wow, that's great. Yeah, thank you, Susan, for sharing your journey, and definitely got to get you back on, talk some more, especially some of your work on Joseph just was groundbreaking.
Well, and you have to get me back on the polygamy thing, because I also encountered, when I was in the 9th grade, Robert Dean Foster, who is one of the most famous independent polygamists, who founded the Rockland down in southern Utah. And he was actually the person who introduced me to Joseph Smith. And as crazy as his life became, he actually married one of my BYU roommates. I would have to say he is the one that taught me my fascination with Joseph Smith. Sorry, that's my dog.
And was he the one that was a seminarian or at BYU, or?
I taught, he was my seminary teacher when I was in the 9th grade. And then he ended up at Provo, his last gig with the church system. He actually was at Provo. And so when I was at BYU, I used to go over and visit him there. So he was, yeah. So actually the last time I saw him was in the 1980s. at the University of Utah, and I saw him sitting there. I hadn't seen him since he actually married my roommate and a woman from my ward as his first and second plural wife. And I saw him sitting there, and as the last time I ever talked to him, he was there because his third wife, who was a younger woman, he said, "I'm getting old." And it turned out he did die of cancer, not a huge amount of time after that. And she's getting education. She was in like a lawyer, a doctor, or something like that. And I'd have to say, I really want to get back to writing about Brother Foster, because really via the Facebook, I've ended up hooking up with some of his children who saw an early article I wrote on him, and they live at Rockland. And it's interesting, like they're children of my old roommate, and most of them aren't polygamous, though they live at Rockland. So I'm just fascinated to go back there. That's one of the things on my list to do.
Wow, great. Well, and you, of course, talk about your engagement with many charismatic figures in your life, and ultimately dealing with one of the greatest ones of all time. That would be Joseph Smith. So thank you again for sharing all this with us. This is fantastic stuff. Daniel, unfortunately, you just keep on breaking out on us. And I think what we're going to do is I'm going to just have you come back on and tell your story on another episode, just you and me. We'll just have to make sure you have a better internet connection, and we'll just do it that way. I apologize, audience. This stuff happens. It's the world of Zoom. You're all very forgiving because we've all been in those Zoom meetings where things go wrong. That's just part of this world that we live in. And so, Daniel, I want to thank you so much for coming on the program today. And we're going to wrap things up here in a second here. Hopefully he was able to hear that. So real quick, Joe and everybody else, I just want to thank all of you for coming on. And I just wanted to maybe why don't you, actually what I would like for you to do, Joe, is to actually preview the upcoming volume that's coming out. Tell us about when it will be available, who's going to be on the book, and then we'll wrap things up.
Yeah, and it is. I'm excited that you and Daniel will just do something, because Daniel's story is amazing, and people need to read Writing Mormon History. I always say you need to read Writing Mormon History because so and so tells their story, but you need to read Writing Mormon History to read Daniel's story. Talk about amazing. Nobody had seen those records and documents that Daniel, and then there's stealing that went on, and there's lawsuits, and I mean we're talking, it was something. So anyway, Writing Mormon History 2. Yeah, it should be out, and I'll send you the link for the catalog that Signature Books has written, and so you can post that. But Writing Mormon History has 20, it's mind-boggling, 20 authors. Now there's chapters that are actually written by 2 authors together, so there's not 20 chapters, but there is 20 authors involved. And it goes with the authors who've just written in the last few years. I've got those folks involved. I was lucky enough to get Jill Durr, who Susan talked about, who wrote Sisters and Little Saints with her. And you know, the fact that Susan and Jill and Linda King Newell had the courage to write about what their experience was in writing Mormon history, I can't emphasize enough how much I appreciate them. And Jill's story is riveting. So that's important. I've got people who've published with Deseret Book, such as Alice Birch, and well, obviously Jill Durr has, because she wrote the official history of the Relief Society, and Bruce Van Orden. And Bruce's story is important and engaging. The up and coming scholars, in some ways, I'm so proud of getting them, such as Matt Bowman and Condon Smith, and Taylor Petrie, and there are others that, and and I know I've forgotten their names, but right now, but they're carrying the torch forward, and this whole movement. There was a lull. The church archives at the time shut down essentially research. Now, as people like to say, I remember there were numerous articles in Dialogue and Sunstone that the horse had already left the barn, and the church archives shut the barn door, and it was a little late. And now we see that with Leonard Arrington's collection up at Utah State University, Mike Quinn's collection at Yale, Pynakker, and others, that the amount of records that had exited the church archives and that were available in the Mormon underground, that now has completely changed. And now we have Nirvana at the Church History Library. They're digitizing records that were closed just a few years ago, closed to research just a few years ago. And now those records are on the internet for every researcher, every historian, every member, anybody who can look at these. It's truly a remarkable time. And so these historians write about their experience. And just a little thing on Condon Smith's article is he was mentored by Val Avery. So in volume 1, we have Linda King Newell's writing about Mormon Enigma and Emma Smith. And in volume 2, we're going to have Condon talk about his experience with being mentored by Val Avery, Linda's co-author. So that's pretty exciting stuff. Again, hopefully it'll be out before MHA.
Right.
One final thing on the volume that you have been showing, the volume 1. So it's weird. All of a sudden, Amazon now has not made, or has cut off their ordering of the hard copy. I think that there was an upshoot in demand, and I don't know, but they just have now not even allowed it. So our friends at Benchmark Books has hard copies, as I've mentioned numerous times, I think even on your Facebook, that there were only about 300 of the hardbound. It is a beautifully done book. It really is a gorgeous book. And there's now about 100 copies left. And it came out right at COVID. I mean, right at COVID is when it was released. And so nobody was paying attention to it. But I believe that once that is gone, those hard copies are gone, that it will become quite a desirable book to have, because it's a gorgeous book in and of itself. And the chapters, I mean, 3 of the authors, unfortunately, have now passed away, with Linda Newell and Will Bagley and Mike Quinn. And you can read their story in that. And then, the other people. So if you want a copy, I suggest you get a hold of Benchmark Books today for that hard copy. And it's 50%. It's 50% off the original retail price.
Can't beat that. Well, that's great to know. My friends at Benchmark, you've all been on my program. Get out there, get a hard copy today, because supplies are running out.
Thank you, Steve.
Bill, I want to thank you for what you did with that book. It really is a fine publication. I mean, it feels good in your hand. It reads well. Super job with the editing. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, Brian and Susan, do you have any final words you'd like to share with the audience before we wrap this thing up? We're all set?
I think I've said enough. So thank you, Steve.
And Susan, I'm glad to finally have gotten you all on. This is great, Susan. It's great we've been talking for years. It's nice to finally get you on Mormon Book Reviews. And folks, I'd like to hear your comments and what you think about this episode and the important role that Mormon historians play. Now, I was just talking to the phone last night with Brent Metcalf. And I told him, Brent, the problem that you had was that you came on the scene 20 years too early. Because if you came on the scene now, you would not be excommunicated from the church. You would be considered to be a very important historian. And he even said, yeah, they would be coming to me for answers on a lot of things. And it's unfortunate because he did a tremendous work and contribution to history. And Susan, you got something to say.
Yeah, I do. I have to say my workflow in Mormon history, because my great goal in life is not to go to a library. And I was really lucky because when I started working on Mormon history in the early 90s, I basically had to use underground stuff. And I used to wonder, how in the hell do you ever footnote this stuff? And then when I came back after 15 years at, Adobe, it was all online, annotated and searchable. And I have to say, I live with the Joe Smith Papers. If you ever want someone to talk about all the weird things on the Joe Smith Papers site, I know that site. But what I was going to say is, so avoiding libraries is my goal. And so my workflow is I Zoom with Brent or talk to Brent Metcalf and figure out all the textual stuff and all the weird things and all the things I need to read. And then I email Joe Geisner and he sends me a copy.
Oh, that's great. I love it. That's great. It's great just for us to hear, people to hear how history is done in the scholarly community and everybody's different approaches to it. And it was really great to get insights from all these great panelists to kind of tell their story. And everybody comes to it from a different angle, a different perspective, a different lens. Outsiders, faithful, you name it, it's all there. And that really is what this endeavor is about. I'd like to hear what you have to think about it. There are links in the description for those of you who'd like to financially support the channel. Don't forget our merch store, MormonBookReviews.com, where you can buy hats, mugs, and t-shirts and all that kind of stuff. And remember, the most important thing is remember, all the voices of the restoration will be heard here on Mormon Book Reviews.